Welcome to the Future is Fun podcast with your hosts, Brian Olds and Danielle Tucker. Buckle up as we explore the latest emerging technologies, business trends, and fascinating discoveries that are shaping our world today. Are you ready? Let's dive in and see what the future has in store.
All right, welcome back to another episode of the Future is Fun podcast. Brian Olds here with Danielle Tucker. What's going on, Danielle?
Hey everyone. Doing good. I'm excited for this conversation.
Me too. We just finished geeking out for like 10 minutes about AI. And so I think that'll be episode 3, but this is episode 2. And we're going to be talking about the future of the 40-hour work week. And I got a lot to say about this because we both now, Danielle, I know you were working. Were you ever a 40-hour a work week person, or did you kind of skip that whole model? Because I feel like you've
Yeah,
been.
I skipped it. I went straight college grad. I mean, I did have like an internship where I did a few like all-nighters, but that wasn't really like a 40-hour work week type situation. But yeah, pretty much after graduation, we started traveling immediately. So I kind of skipped that phase of
So,
things.
so you've never had a full time. I got to show up at the office 8 hours a day. That's incredible. That's amazing.
Mm-mm.
Because that's why I'm so glad to have you as a co-host for this, because I'm on the opposite end. I spent 11 years working actually for an HR company. I worked for a staffing recruiting agency, and that was my entry point into the workforce. Um, and also, there's a funny side story because I actually before that I worked. I did an internship for um, a I guess a government like integrator, like one of the big, tech. I don't want to say which one, but basically I worked for them, and that was my kind of first introduction into. It was a summer internship, and that was my first introduction into like the world of full time work in my junior year of college. And then I remember getting introduced into like flexible like hours where, you could work 8 hours and you can come in later basically. And the idea was you would come in, like if you came in at 9, you could leave at, 5 or like 6 or something like that. But if you come in at 10, you would leave at 7, and so on and so forth. So there was this window, and nobody explained that to me. So I remember I was coming in at like 10 and leaving at like 3, because I was like, oh, this flexible. You could just like make it up wherever. And one day somebody put me aside and it's like, no, if you come in later, you need to stay later. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, this isn't as fun, but that's
The
fine.
work was still getting done. Like, what does it matter?
Well, I mean, I was an intern. And the other thing
Oh
about that is
yeah.
that yeah, so I was an intern. So it wasn't like I was doing anything mission critical. I was giving tours and, telling people
Yeah.
kind of where stuff is located. Like, but also the thing about that is that there's a limit to that. So like, some people can come in at 6 a.m. and like leave at 3. But I'm kind of like in between some of those windows, there's not that much work that you can actually do at like 4 or 5 a.m. And I would argue probably like 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock at night, either in certain industries and certain professions. So if you have to rely on other people and you're kind of working in like a standard US time zone, but then there are some other places where, you could probably they almost expect you to start because you're supporting like Asia or Europe or one of these other like countries or continents, and it's crazy. But in any case, we're gonna be talking about the 40-hour work week. I'm excited to dive in because this is something that's top of mind for a lot of people right now. Coming out of the pandemic, I think there was a massive shift, of course, for many workers who had the option to go to telework, and now there's this tension to kind of go back into the office, and so there's a lot to talk about there. And so what I love to do, Danielle, is kind of go into maybe a little bit of the history of the 40-hour work week, and so just so people can kind of get some perspective, and then kind of dive into um, how we can kind of break this down. But a lot of this I did not know. Did you know anything about the history of the 40-hour work week or where it came from?
Well, I guess I'm about to find out. I don't think I did.
It's like one of those things you don't really think about, I guess.
Yeah, I guess I'm very interested to hear what you share.
Yeah. Well, from my perspective, it's kind of like it's one of those things that you're just kind of born into, and you just assume that oh, that's just the way it's done, but it wasn't always done like that. So apparently, in 1817, going all the way back to 19th century, there was a British member of Parliament. It was a guy named Robert Owen, and he proposed the idea of an 8-hour a day workday. And basically, his argument was that it would lead to improved efficiency, better quality of life for workers. So, at the time, there wasn't really any standard for work. People just kind of worked until they were physically exhausted and then you would like leave or go home. And so fast forward to the United States, in the late 19th century and early 20th century, labor unions started to form. Of course, we know those today as unions. And so they basically, these advocacy groups that would, you know, employers now had a vehicle, excuse me, employees now had a vehicle to start to negotiate the number of hours that they would work, safer working conditions, increased pay, and all of these things. And so in 1916, the U.S. Congress passed a bill that established the 8-hour workday. And it was actually with the railroads. And so, which is funny because there's this whole thing with the railroads now. But
Mhm.
1916, U.S. Congress got something done. And so it was like, hey, everybody's going to kind of have this standardized workday. And then in 1926, the Ford Company, um, Henry Ford, was one of the first companies in the U.S. to institute the 8-hour standard for workers. And so, fast forward now, getting closer to modern day, the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938 established a 40-hour work week as the standard for most industries and provided for overtime for work beyond that limit. So that's kind of like been the progression up to this point. And so now 40-hour a week became full-time work, and then anything less than that, according to the Fair Labor Standards Act, is considered part-time.
That is such an interesting breakdown of the historical timeline of how this all played out. And also, I find it very interesting thinking about how I would say people in today's time think about work compared to what you described many, many years ago. I also find that to be very interesting. Like, so they created the 8-hour day was created as a way to keep people from overworking. Am I understanding that right?
Well, I think it was a way to. So I think what was happening is that because this guy Robert Owen, I'm assuming I need to. He was a lawmaker, so he's a member of British Parliament, but it said efficiency and better quality of life. And so at a certain point, I think what folks eventually realize is that people aren't machines.
Mhm.
If you work people to death, they will literally die and you won't be able to easily replace them. Like, I feel like now, current state, and we'll get into this in a little bit, but we can kind of pull labor from different places, when people are migrating to your country, but to a certain degree, you only have a certain amount of people to actually be able to do work. And then also, as work gets more specialized, that pool of labor starts to shrink. And so I think what he started to realize is that if you have 100 employees and you are able to, let's say, not work them to death, like let's say you get like 75% of that available output from that person, but that person is able to work, you know, 15, 20, 30, 40 years, that's better than burning out a person, so to speak, and then them not being able to only work 5 years. And then now, you don't have anybody else to replace them eventually. So I think that's where that premise came from. It was a more of an economic decision versus a humanistic decision, which I think is
Mm.
probably where a lot of policies and stuff kind of start anyway. People are just looking at how can we make the most money.
Yeah. That's very interesting. I don't think I heard of that story before, but it's definitely very interesting to hear how it was formed and just kind of compare and contrast with what we're experiencing today, and also how things have evolved over time to, to what we're seeing and what we're experiencing, and even like what the conversations that people are having about the 8 hour day, 4 hour work week scenario. So that is very intriguing.
Yeah. And so what I did is I was like, okay, so we're going to talk about the future of the 40-hour work week. I kind of teased out five of what I kind of call key elements, or five drivers around what will probably impact the future of the 40-hour work week. And I definitely have some opinions. I want to get yours, Danielle. But so the five elements are, I think it'll be driven by economics, technology, a shift in employer values, healthcare, and then also availability of talent. So those are the five. So we can go through each one and kind of, talk about them and get some perspective. And then, for folks listening to the podcast, if you are an expert on any of these topics, which I am not. So, despite having worked 11 years and the for a contingent workforce company, these are all pretty complex and dynamic issues, and so I think the goal here is just to kind of be able to provide some insight. But I'm not an economist. I'm not a technologist. I'm not a HR lawyer. I'm not a human resources manager anymore. And so none of these things I'm trying to be the expert on, but I think it could open up a great conversation. So let's look at the first one, economics as one of the first key elements. So I believe, going back to this guy Robert Owen, what he was talking about is that there's an economic element in terms of how long people actually need to work and how hard we need to work. And so when we think about the country as a whole, indicators like GDP, gross domestic product, is all about like how much value we are actually producing as a nation. And so obviously the more productive we are as an economy, the wealthier we become. But also, um, you know, I think conventional wisdom is the more efficient we can become at producing those things. If it took us, if 5 years ago it took us um, 100 hours to do a task that now it only takes 50 hours, because of technology or whatever, that's a productivity, that's an efficiency increase. Even though if the productivity is relatively the same. So it's like, okay, just pure economics is like driving this. And so one of the things I found, Danielle, is that one of the biggest costs to any business is actually people. Like human resources is on the balance sheet is going to be the largest kind of line item that companies have to pay for. And so for many companies, it's 70% or more of its overall operating expense. And so I think just pure economics is going to drive a big chunk of this. But what are your thoughts?
Yes, I agree with that. This is actually something I was talking with Devarius about just really just before this conversation. Is like, how and why is are the dynamics of like the work environment changing in the way that they are with what we're seeing right now? And a big part of that, just talking about, we were talking about like uh, decisions that companies are making, and what that looks like on like the receiving end as someone who may be an employee within a company, and like what that may look like for them in the work week, but also like why are they making the decisions that they're making, and why are they choosing to make the specific choices that they are. And a big part of it is like, what I would agree with you is just the advancements in terms of efficiency, with the all of the really interesting and uh, all of the different technological advancements that are coming out, and also seeing evidence of how people have been using technology in a smaller scale to become more efficient on like a single person type basis. I think a lot of companies are thinking, okay, like how can we utilize the tech on from like an economic stance in order to be more efficient and to, you know, lower the output and the cost in order to increase profit. So uh yeah, definitely economics, like the economic part of it definitely plays into what is shaping the 40-hour work week. uh it's I also would say, you know, with making these choices, it kind of it like puts people in a place where they have to kind of view their options, you know, like for like bigger companies, like they make decisions from one view, and then but also if you're currently working or may have experience working in a 40-hour work week, your perspective on it is like a completely different point of view. And so I think being able to like look at how to increase efficiency across both parties, I guess, is going to be most helpful for everyone. But certainly, like the economic part of it is like, yeah, definitely, it's definitely a part that plays into it.
And it might be helpful if we kind of look at like the two perspectives, because I feel like on this narrative, there's kind of it's like the who did the Tale of Two Cities? Is that like Dickerson? I need to go back
Uh,
and
I
look
need to
at
research that one too.
it. What was that Wishbone episode where we had
Yes.
but Tale of Two Cities, I feel like it's the same here. Like there's a tale of two experiences. There's employers and then there's employees. And so there's all this push pull dynamic where I feel like employees are always going to want to make basically as much money as possible. Like they're
Mhm.
incentivized, like we want to make as much money as possible for their role with the least amount of headache, I think, and the highest levels of job satisfaction. So those are the things
Mhm.
that employees come into a company trying to optimize: pay, experience, and like minimize headache. And then employers are like, I want to pay you the least amount of money that I can, um, to get the level of talent relative to the level of talent and the value that you're providing in that organization. And so you won't leave, because if you leave, then I got to replace you. And it costs like, thousands of dollars just to find, recruit, bring in, train, and up ramp somebody else. So they want to
Mhm.
basically pay you the least amount that they can in order to replace you. But then they also are charged, to your point about with increasing profitability. And so particularly public companies are under a lot of pressure externally to not just make money, but efficiently run operations to maximize like shareholder value, I guess. And so yeah, it's this push pull dynamic. And so I think it might be cool to kind of look at how these things impact employees and employers. So my question for you is, w- based on what you're saying in those economics, like, is it from the employee perspective? I think most people would agree that most people probably don't want to work 40 hours a week if they don't have to. Um, I guess I'm thinking. I know I
Yes.
wouldn't.
This is well, what should we call it? An assumption?
An assumption.
Or yes.
I think it's a sweeping assumption.
Yes.
Um, or if you do work 40 hours, I know we're going to look at some of these case studies in a little bit, but maybe if I'm working 40 hours, maybe we don't want it spread out over 5 days. Um, you know, or and certain professions do that. Like I know like nurses and most I think health professionals work like 12 on 12 off and things like that. But it's kind of from an employee perspective, you got this thing. But then on the employer side, do you even want to do you even want to operate like 40 hours a week? Like, is that helpful for companies? um, Regardless of the economic output, like, does it make sense? Because you think about the burden of resources, as 40 hours plus in a lot of cases of electricity, of security, of manager, like meeting, like, is that healthy for a company? And so those are the two different veins. But what do you think? Does it matter one way or the other? Like, do you think it'll change, based on employee versus employer?
Yeah, I think it's gonna have to change. I think in order to weather through the friction of what we've been seeing between the two parties, there has to be some give and take for both. And I mean, when I think about it from like the employed perspective, like we want to have the highest level of experience within our lives, and we also want to make sure that we're able to do things that we want and that we need, like taking care of family, taking care of our bodies, taking care of health, and but also from like I'm thinking about this from as a perspective of a business owner and CEO. Like I also think about like I think perspective has a lot to do with it because CEO, like how many hours do they work? I mean,
Psh, all of
we
them.
hear, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just a lot. Like, no, I
Yeah.
think most CEOs probably work like 60 or 70 hours.
Yeah. And so their perspective looking outward, I'm sure they have an idea from their experience. They know how many hours they've worked. So like why shouldn't everyone else be able to do exactly what they've done? And so I think it's going to require a level of uh, I guess emotional intelligence maybe is the word that I'm looking for people to kind of like see both sides of the story. And also, I think recognizing that different people are in different roles because, they're really good at it. And,
Mm.
one isn't necessarily better than the other, I would say, but I think it's most importantly about finding that balance between how to increase efficiency, which again, we're in a really unique time because we're seeing advancements with technology in order to be able to help improve that. But also like how to do it in a way that is going to make everyone happy and to do it in a way to where we're reducing the amount of negative detrimental results and increasing more of the positive and more desirable outcomes.
Yeah, no, I think that was a really good point. I think it, this is probably one of those things where, you mentioned, making everybody happy. I don't know if that's a real thing in real life, because I can't think of any other situation where, like, I can't even plan a family reunion and get, everybody on the same page. But I do think that um, a big challenge that, we kind of are locked into, and again, going back to the history, you know, the Ford Motor Company instituted a 40-hour work week in 1926. It's 2022 at the time of this recording, about to be 2023. The world has changed. That was almost 100 years ago when
Yeah.
this was, and so what about the world? How do you think about how much the world has changed in 100 years? Like, and technology is actually the next thing that we're going to, with the, so we talked about economics. Number two is technology. The world has changed so much, but we still cling to these systems that no longer serve us. And we do this even in our personal lives too. Like, how many of us have, started to do things, because at one point in our lives it made sense, and at a certain point in our life it no longer made sense, but we continue to do it out of habit. And I think a lot of the systems that we have set up now harken back to that. There was no telework in 1926. You either on the assembly line or you weren't on the assembly line. There were no um, there was no I think the side hustles were limited. Like, the idea that you get off of work and go to another job was probably not just rare, but probably frowned upon. It was kind of like, I think it was called moonlighting, or, when you go out and, a lot of employers now still have that kind of written into their policy. Like, you are physically not allowed to work at another company while you're working at their company full time. And that to me is just kind of crazy. So there's been this like
Yeah.
massive shift in technology and also society, and a lot of the rigid policies and framework and also thought process for organizations just has not caught up yet with that, with those realities.
Yeah, what do you think it's gonna take for the gap to kind of be dwindled down in that regard? Any thoughts?
I think it's already dwindling. Like,
Yeah.
I think it is dwindling away right now. I think people are um calling BS on companies that have these inflexible policies for the purpose of not. So we went to Barbados this year twice, and one of the big things that Barbados did during the pandemic is they were trying to figure out ways to incentivize people to come to the island. Barbados is a small country; it's like 300,000 people. It's a beautiful place, and it's kind of like, you see those memes where people are working on that laptop, by the pool or by the ocean,
Mhm.
and uh it's literally that. And so if you're going to escape somewhere, like Barbados is probably the place to do it, or anywhere in the Caribbean, probably, to get that type of experience. So they created this thing called the welcome stamp that would essentially allow you, for a small fee, to basically, because most of the time, if you travel to an island like that or any country, the expectation is that you're visiting, so you don't really need like a long-term visa. This visa would allow you to stay, um, for a much longer extended period, I think over a year. And it worked. There was like a ton of people that like took advantage of that.
Hmm.
But then when the pandemic ended and companies were kind of like, okay, well, it's time to come back in the office, the overwhelming question became, for what? Like,
Why?
yeah, I clearly demonstrated I could do my job. We had all these meetings. They were not necessary. For the ones that were necessary, we got on Teams or got on Zoom and figured it out. I don't, there's this thing, quality of life survey they do every year. Said the average person, the average commute time in the United States. Or actually, I'm gonna ask you, how long you think the average commute time is, Danielle?
Mm.
Like one way, one way.
One way? Oh,
Yep.
gosh. Average? I wanna say like 2.5 to 3 hours.
Okay. Well, fortunately, not that bad.
Oh, good.
Yeah, that's horrible. Oh my god, that, and you know what? And this is, you've never had a full time like situation, so that's good. So yeah, the
Sorry if
average.
I induced some anxiety, Brian.
Nah, I'm in therapy. It's fine. We're working through it. But no, the average is actually 26 minutes.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, I was way off.
But that's one way. So to get back home, if you don't want to stay at the office, it takes 52 minutes. So the average, let's just say, is an hour, right? Average
Yeah.
commute. Some people closer, and when people are moving or relocating for jobs, the commute time is a big factor typically in your decision making process of where you're going to live. Are you going to be in the city? Do you want to live in the county? Is there mass transportation? Like, what's the parking situation? That's time, and there's also cost. But check this out. So let's say if the average commute is an hour, if you're working 5 days a week, 40 hours, 5 days a week, and let's say, vacations, holidays, time off, whatever, it's 52 weeks in a year. Let's say you only work 45 weeks per year, which most of us work probably 50 weeks a year, but 45 weeks per year. That means for 1 hour a day, you're in your car for 300 minutes. That's 5 hours, right? Just in your
Mhm.
car. That means you are spending 13,500 minutes per year, or 225 hours, just in your car. you're not getting paid for that time either. That's just
Mm.
the expected time that you're there commuting. And what's happening during that time? Not only are you not spending time with your family or doing things that you actually care about, you are um, breathing in an insane amount of pollution. You are potentially putting yourself in, they say, being in traffic is like magnitudes more dangerous than, the act of driving is way more dangerous than flying or any other form of transportation. Um, Road rage. It's not healthy to be sitting for that long, all these other things. And it's kind of like people don't want to do it. And so to answer your question, I think it's already changing. We've seen companies like dig in to the notion, and some people that are on the other side. Elon Musk, I think, is a famous example of that. He bought Twitter and is demanding everybody to come back in and go super hardcore. He canceled. They had these things called what were they called? Rest days. They had
Mhm.
days of rest was what they were called.
Yes,
And
I read about that.
he was like, nah, bro, like and that's because that's his consistent thing at Tesla, at SpaceX. Like he expects people to work. And so there are definitely people like leaders who kind of operate on this principle of like, if you're not in the office, if I can't physically see you, like you are not working hard enough. And so I think that's the perception that, folks are trying to fight against.
Mm, mhm. I think it's, also with, just, like, scientific studies and stuff like that of, like, seeing how rest actually improves efficiency. I think, being able to I would love to see even more data and use have that information be used in support of creating more opportunities for companies to kind of recognize even more of like why rest is so important. I know after like a really long day of just like hard work, I'm just, like even just after like a few hours of like really intense brain work, I'm just like down for the count by the afternoon. So I can only imagine like being in a situation of having to do that like constantly. And also even just thinking about like using brain power compared to like using physical, like doing physical labor, like solving problems can be, in my opinion, can be just as exhausting as doing like a really intense workout sometimes. So yeah, I think it's like, and it's good to really see a lot more companies like making changes and seeing the importance of that. And I also am excited to see more of it in the future. So yeah.
No, you're right about that. I do think there's a disparity between what some people kind of constitute as work. And so there's like physical labor, and then there's like people who are like knowledge workers primarily. And then, of course, things in between. So if you're out like digging ditches or, doing construction work or, working on an assembly line or, God forbid, an Amazon warehouse, um, well, if we get sponsored by Amazon one day, we love y'all. But if not, God
Yes.
forbid, an Amazon warehouse, like those things are kind of like, oh, I can clearly see you are working hard, you're dirty, you're sweaty at the end of the day. But so yeah, so that's my overall point. I think that this whole narrative that knowledge workers don't do as much work as like physical laborers is insane. And just to put a final point on that, I remember reading about there's been this controversy. I don't know if you've seen this like in the chess world now, where um this really famous guy, I forget his name, but he basically is like one of the biggest, like best chess players in the world. And he accused the other guy of cheating,
Hmm.
and he forfeited the match. He was like, based on the way he was doing his moves, he was like, there's no way a person could like move like that. And so when I was learning about that, one of the things that the article mentioned about chess is that chess is such an intellectually intense um, exercise for people that you could burn up to 1,000 calories in a single chess game that, let's say it takes like a couple hours. Like your brain uses an intense amount of energy to work. and you may not be sweating, you may not see muscles and stuff like that, but it takes a lot of a lot of energy. So I absolutely agree with that. One story I wanted to share with you was my first month as a full-time employee. And so I remember getting hired. I actually started work like right after college. And so I was all excited. And actually I started a couple weeks before I graduated, but classes were done. And I remember driving in. I remember my first commute. And like everybody, kind of be there at 8 o'clock. So I ended up getting there like 7:45 or something like that. That was actually a 34-minute commute for me. So I spent over an hour a day in the
Mm.
car. And that's in perfect traffic conditions. Don't let it rain. Don't let it be an
Oh
accident.
my gosh.
Don't let, a turtle flip over on the side of the road. Like, that was perfect traffic conditions. And I had to go through the tunnel. There's a harbor tunnel here, and that was like an additional $2 or $3 every single day, both ways.
Oh, wow.
So it was expensive, it was time consuming, and it was early. And so I remember getting into the office 8 o'clock, starting to do stuff, kind of getting settled. And by like 11 o'clock, I was exhausted. Like, and I was working in like accounts receivable. I was doing like, I was playing with like Excel spreadsheets and calling people and stuff like that. And then we would eat lunch. And by lunch, you know how people, eat lunch and you have the crash at like 1 o'clock PM. And then it was like 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock. And by 3 o'clock PM in my first week of working, I would say my first month actually, it was May when I started. Um, by 3 o'clock, I had hit like an absolute wall. Like, I was like, I remember thinking to myself, how do people do this? Like, I'd spent all these years going to 8 o'clock classes, but in college, you might have a class at 8 o'clock, you may have another class at like 10 o'clock, and then like a class at like 2 o'clock, and then you're like done. And then Tuesday, Thursday, you might have like two classes in between, you get naps in between. But this was the expectation now in the real world is that I wake up. By the way, I woke up at between like 6 and 6:15, took an hour to get ready, out the door by 7 to get to work by 8, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Get home. I got home. If I left the office at 5, which never happened, we are rolling out like 5:30, 6 o'clock PM. By the way, it's now dark if you're past September. So
Mhm.
you're going to work in the dark, you're coming home and it's dark. And I would leave the office 6 o'clock sometimes, 6:30. I've left the office as late as 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock sometimes, but typically like 7 o'clock is like the latest. But let's say I left at 6. I then have a commute back, rush hour. So let's say I got home at 7. I eat dinner. By the time I eat, I'm exhausted and I'm ready to go to sleep. And I have to wake up the next morning at 6 and do it all over again. And so for the people that had kids and the people that like had taken care of older parents or had pets, it blew my I had no idea how I was supposed to squeeze my actual life into this format. And so for a lot of years I didn't. Like I literally didn't have a life. And then my coworkers, they were going out drinking and doing all this stuff. I'm like, I am tired and I'm 23 years old. So I had no idea how I was supposed to make that work.
Wow. Did you ever ask them, like, "Do you sleep?" Like, "What do you guys do?"
It was I well, yeah, I found out two secrets. That's two hacks. Hack
Yes,
number
tell me.
one was coffee. Um, I had never drank coffee in my entire life until I got to corporate America. Um,
Really?
no, I didn't have a reason to drink coffee. Like in college, I mean, we may have had energy drinks every now and then, but to me, I never, as a young adult, as a teenager, in high school, all that stuff, like I never remember struggling with my actual energy level until I got into a full-time corporate work environment.
Mm.
And then the second hack, which is the more depressing one, is adaption or adoption. I think adaptation.
Adaptation, yeah.
Thank you. Adaptation was the next one because eventually I got used to it. So I started in May. Um, And so by September, I think I had acclimated primarily to it. And I did it for another 10 years, but it was a rough transition. It was a rough transition. I remember when I transitioned out of corporate and my first full day as a full-time entrepreneur, um, and that jarring difference of not having to be anywhere at a specific time was indescribable. So
Yes. I love that so much. The freedom, the realization of freedom, I guess, would you say?
I would say that is absolutely what I was fighting for. That to me was worth more than the paycheck. It was worth more than health insurance. It was worth more than a 401k match. It was worth more than free food after training class. It's, it was the thing. Which actually leads me to my third point, which is a shift in employee values. As so we talked about technology, we talked about economics, but I think a shift in how people view work, how they think about work, is really one of the probably to me is the one of the leading drivers. And again, I think COVID accelerated this, but this notion that I can be at home, I can have time with my kids. Because by the way, the US, I don't know how other countries work specifically with all of this, but it's always been really weird to me that adults go to work, adults and kids pretty much have to be at school at 8 o'clock a.m. on average. But kids get out at 3, and
Mhm.
adults have to work on average like another 2 to 3 hours. And so by the time you get home from work, if you're a parent, and I'm not, but just, being a kid, a latchkey kid, as they say, as well as just kind of observing this, it was always jarring to me that we let school kids out of school at 3, and we're expected, like, who picks you up, like who's supposed to, like, if I'm supposed to be working. So the quality of life just doesn't match the way things are kind of done, and I think people are kind of taking notice of that and taking affirmative action to align their life to the things that really really make sense, instead of waiting for this one future day where we'll be retired and you can do what you want type of thing.
Yes. I know from what I've seen and experienced living in other countries, I know like when we were in Ecuador, a lot of what I saw in terms of like schools and the work environment, a lot of people really their business and their home were all in the same place. So, like in Ecuador, if you were to go to some of the cities, you'll see it's like it has two levels. And so,
Hmm.
like, the bottom level is like their tienda. It's like where people can come in, buy stuff, do business, whether it's like a printing shop or it's like a store where you buy your groceries, whatever that particular business that that family did was on the first floor. And then come closing time, when it was, time for dinner, they turn the lights, shut the door, and just go upstairs. And that would be their home. And so I think culturally, kind of just thinking about how like the work and home situation were crafted from what I saw from that experience was really interesting. It's kind of like their business was like it was integrated within their lifestyle. And then also from like the school context, the communities were like bubbles, I would say, like a lot smaller, not so spread out. Like here in the US, it's like you have the commute, you have to like drive on the highway, or you have to like go, like your destinations are very spread apart. But in the other countries where we've been, where also in Malawi, like there were people were walking everywhere. Like the kids literally walked from school to to their house and back. It's a very common thing. And
But when they
you
got there,
know,
were their parents there, or were they, like, who was watching them?
I mean, that is a very good question. Oftentimes they were from a young age, they were taught how to take care of themselves and even how to like work in the store, work in like doing the family business. Like it was something that was instilled from a young age, kind of like an expected type of thing. When I think about it, I never really saw any kids Oh, here's another thing. Kids actually played outside. Like there was no like video games. They were either like riding a bike or playing with a ball or playing with a in the dirt. Like there was no like going up to play video games or anything like that. It was always like playing outside or helping with chores. And so uh I think culture also has something to do with it. And I think that's also something very interesting because the communities were very close knit as
Hmm.
well. Everyone, you know, you knew your neighbors. Kids were fine to come to walk home and go to school and things like that. But thinking about what things look like here in the US, with kids getting off from school, like you either take the bus or your parents get you from the car line, and then it's just like very different dynamics. And you know with that cultural difference, I think it also allows for more uh, peace in terms of like the mental stress that goes into it as well, because when you know that your kids and your business and your home are like all in one location, like it's to me it seems a lot easier to manage. You know your neighbors. There's not a lot of problem solving, I guess, that you really kind of have to think, or maybe different scenarios that may cause stress or fear of like, oh, well, what if we don't get there on time? Where are the kids going to go? Like, there's just so many different dynamics that can come into place um, with, I think, the scenario that you previously described of like work and school. And so I think that definitely plays into it as well of like, uh, just the emotional labor, I guess, of having to solve the problems in that way. But having the peace of mind and knowing that your business and your home, uh, are in the same location, and then like school is also very close knit. I think that also is like really interesting perspective that to see and to kind of question like, I wonder if what things could look like if we maybe experimented with something like that on a large scale here in the US too.
I think we have. I think there are some companies that have very intentionally, and I don't even think it's a new concept. I think there are some companies that have essentially created like towns out of nothing and
That is
have,
interesting.
yeah, they adopted this approach of, oh, we want to we need to hire like 10,000 people in like New Mexico, and so let's build, in addition to just building our corporate headquarters and manufacturing facility or whatever, we're also going to essentially build this kind of like fake town, but not like fake, but like we're going to create like a town out of nothing. And you'll have a place to work. You'll be like, literally, you could like bike to work or walk or catch a tram or something. Like you don't have to necessarily drive. And then this is an episode of The Simpsons, actually, which, by the way, we should do a whole episode, I think, deep dive on that. By the way, if we could add
Yeah.
that into it, because the Simpsons is like famous for predicting the future.
Yeah.
And but this was an episode of The Simpsons where Homer, he got a job for this company. The company ended up being run by like a guy that was like trying to take over the world or whatever. And he was like, "Why are you recruiting me?" And he was like, you know, they moved from Springfield to this fictional town, and then the house was like so state of the art that Marge actually didn't have any housework because all of the house was doing, it was like cleaning for her and like changing the baby and doing all this stuff. And then the schools, similar to what you said, like Bart and Lisa ended up being in this super advanced like magnet school, and like Lisa was like top of her class, but Bart ended up going to kindergarten because he couldn't keep up just like the rest of the class. And so they all were trying to like adapt. Marge started drinking during the day because she couldn't, like, she got bored and started disassociating from her identity as a housewife. And Homer was like doing great, even though he didn't know exactly what he's been hired to do. He's like leading the team, just was basically like motivating them to work harder, but they were actually building this like death ray to like take over the world or whatever. So I think companies, The Simpsons do a really good job of kind of capturing this intersection between reality and pop culture, but um I don't know. Like, I'm not sure if, again, kind of teasing out the the objectives of employers versus employees, I wonder where that would stand today because, while we see places like Silicon Valley, and I know I just read this thing, same thing is happening with, Amazon and some of these other companies where they decide to put a corporate headquarters somewhere. Their biggest thing, again, 70% of their revenue or their expense is like talent. Like, how do we get the people here? But once they're there, like, I don't know if I want to live in a planned community that my company owns. Like, I don't know if I want to send my kids to the one school that you all created, versus sending them to, a private or parochial or something like that. So I don't know. Like, I don't know if that's the future of what that would look like versus just saying, hey, um, there are some jobs that there are some jobs that just make sense for them to be remote, and there are some jobs that just make sense that no matter what happens, not only are they not going to be remote, but you know this is not a 60 or 70 week hour week position. So it's a difficult thing, but I'm glad you brought that up because I actually want to dive into that a little bit more.
Yes.
The other thing I had was so we covered we're probably like overtime, but we covered economics, technology, shift in employee values. The last two we can kind of lump them together for the purpose of time, but healthcare is another one, and then access to talent. I put healthcare in there simply because the reality is that people are living longer, um, and so obviously the longer people live, the more working years you potentially have. And I don't know if this is necessarily as much tied to the future of the 40-hour work week, to the future of just work in general, but I do believe that you know, this idea of people working, retiring to 65 is potentially problematic now more so than ever because of the fact that if the life expectancy is now inching its way up, and if you actually end up living to 95 and you retire at 65, there's 30 years of life that you have to pay for, but you retired in a place where um the amount of money you make or plan to live off of is going to be significantly less than probably what you need 10, 20, or 30 years in the future. And then the challenge with that is that not all work, depending on what type of work you did, is actually sustainable into those like golden years. And so healthcare is a big piece, and then just access to labor is of course changing as well. We have folks who are not in this country but can still work in the US. And
Mhm.
that includes US citizens and non-US citizens. Like, we're no longer just confined to our borders. And so that does kind of open up this idea that you not only do you not need to be geographically connected to your employer, but I can access labor 24 hours a day anywhere, anytime. And so does the expectations, as the bar shift to now, oh, instead of actually being open from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m., some companies are now, the expectation, even as consumers, is that you're available 24 hours a day. Like, if I place an Amazon order for toothpaste at 2 a.m. and I expect to see it tomorrow morning at 10 a.m., somebody has to fulfill that order. Somebody has to pick it. Somebody has to pack it. Somebody has to, and it needs to go out. So those are the two things, the two last ones: healthcare and access to talent. Any thoughts on either one of those two?
Yes, I do have thoughts. So, one point that I really wanted to make sure that we talked about is I think there's a lot of I think the idea of changing the 40-hour week feels really glamorous in a lot of ways. And I also think really the solution will, and I feel like this is like $1 million solution, or like this is like something that people have questions about, and are looking to solve. But I think a big way to create a solution that feels really great for everyone is just to have more of a flex type model, um, because we think about corporate versus entrepreneurship versus like what is the best way to go about the 40-hour work week for health, and to create the most efficiency in terms of talent. And I would say, thinking about my experience, and also the experience of my husband, like as we've been traveling over like the past 7 years, um, thinking about my experience, I realized that there were different environments where I felt like I really thrived. And I also recognize that the environments that some people thrive in is actually not the same for everyone. And so, from like a healthcare perspective, I think thinking about like the mental side of it, like the making sure that you have the support from like like your mental well-being whenever it comes to like the 40-hour work week, is something that have found very interesting to think about, because I tend to thrive with like a lot of flexibility, leading myself, creating my own rules, like being like I'm okay to like be in my house working in like an office setting and having the flexibility in terms of creating my hours with my work like that. And my husband, on the other hand, is actually very different. Now he can be like, if he has to work in like a at home setting, like he's done it, he can do it. And from my observation, I think he actually really thrives being in more of a corporate setting, being around a group of people, team, like really doing a lot of problem solving in person. That's another conversation that I think a lot of people have been addressing since, a lot of companies have been requesting for people to come back into the office, is like a large number of people don't want to, but then there's also a percentage of people who actually have stated they want to go back and they want to experience being in that type of environment. And
Mhm.
I used to not understand that. Like I used to be like, why? Like, why would you? But I think, seeing and hearing from his perspective and hearing about his experiences has helped me to have more grace to kind of like see and understand people's perspectives in that way. And it's also made me wonder if is it really about the location, or is it more so about the flexibility in terms of like how the time is being spent. And so that's something that I've really been thinking, because for some people, being in your home office, setting your own hours, like from like a mental like well-being perspective, is just not healthy for them, and it's not something that they really want to do or that they thrive with. But I think really creating a the future of the 40-hour work week, I don't know if it really has to do with location more so than it does creating flexibility in a way that honors a person's well-being, honors their health, and allows them to be able to live a lifestyle that feels good for them, whatever they decide that looks like. So that's how I feel about it.
That is a beautiful way to kind of, I think, punctuate this conversation, because um you know you brought up something really important, which is everybody's different, basically. And that just because one person thrives and in one environment doesn't mean at home doesn't mean everybody does, and because some people thrive in the office doesn't mean everybody does. So allowing some flexibility is, I think, the key. And I think companies are slowly starting to get that, particularly if they want to remain competitive. I think one thing we didn't even have a chance to go into in this episode is like the generational differences, and
Mhm.
what the expectation is of the employer employee relationship and what work actually looks like. Baby boomers probably are, I think the typical narrative is that, they are, the come in early, stay late, they FaceTime is kind of the order today. Like, they're used to more of those traditional like work structures, and Gen Z is like, you want me to do what? You want me to put a tie on? What are you talking
What? With
about?
who?
Like, like, I, like how
What? With
much?
who? For how many animal crackers?
And you see those TikToks where they're like, "Oh, I'm on vacation," or like how different generations like tell their boss like they're going on like vacation, and like the baby boomers are like, "Hey, it's like 3 months in advance, like, hey, I'm going to be going, down the street for a day. I just want to let you know I sent you a calendar invite. I wrote you an email." And then millennials are kind of like, hey, I'm going on vacation, but I'll be available, if you need me or whatever. Here's my cell phone. Here's my hotel. Here's my whatever. And then Gen Z on the other end is like, hey, I'm out. I'll see you. They're like, where you
Deuces.
going?
Bye.
I'm out. Like, well, can we call you? Nope. Are you, where can you? Nope. Like,
Nope.
are you going to have your laptop? I left my laptop in the desk. Like, I'm not, I'll see you. Well, if I email you, well, out of office is on. So like, there's all these like differences. And so I think flexibility is the word that I would kind of punctuate this conversation with, Danielle. And, I think as we're thinking about flexibility, one of the fundamental things that probably needs to change also is actual job design, because right now I feel like the way job descriptions and roles within companies are created, it still kind of has that like rigid structure. It's like, hey, this is either on site or it's remote, or it's either,
Hmm.
this or that. And it's like, it's either full time or part time. And the reality is, I can't think of too many positions where, something is kind of one way all the time. Like this role is like, very few tasks take 40 hours to complete every single week. You probably
Yeah.
have people and organizations that are um working um, on tasks, projects, or inbound labor that is really, they're doing jobs that could probably take 20 hours to do, but they're stretching it out to 40 because that's what they get paid for. And you have some people that are under resourced and they're trying to desperately to get 70 hours of stuff done within just 40 hours or even like less. And so I think if we're going to get smarter about something, it's not just, taking into account the individual employee preferences, but also getting smarter about how we designate work and what that should look like. And maybe starting to abandon this idea of full time versus part time, and just um, really get smarter about that. Now, the one case study that I like, this Chick-fil-A pilot that happened in November 2022. Um, they are offering 3 days a week for their people, so it's still full time work. They're actually working 13 to 14 hours a day, but they're only working for 3 days. And it's not all Chick-fil-A; it's just this one location in Florida that did this. And the manager that came up with it said it was designed to reduce burnout, increase employee retention, and actually demonstrate, um, better leadership. And so what happened was they had about 160 employees, which again, that blew my mind. I'm like, 160 people work at one Chick-fil-A, but Chick-fil-A makes a lot of money. This company, this one location does about $17 million a year in revenue. And so they ran the pilot for a couple weeks, and it ended up that not only did they improve employee morale, they reduced attrition, and they reported higher levels of employee satisfaction, but also boosted like profitability. And when it comes to recruiting talent, they are now getting, at the time of this article, which is November 2022, they now get 429 applications every single week to work there. So they have no issue finding talent or people. And so these are all net benefits that I think, other companies could potentially model if they are willing to be your word, flexible around how this thing looks. Um, we might end up breaking this into 2 episodes because I feel like this is like a mega episode.
This is long. Yes.
So this would be probably like a two-parter. But I think it was a healthy conversation, nonetheless. Any closing thoughts on your end?
Yeah, that's thinking about the numbers you just shared about Chick-fil-A is, like, phenomenal, and it also just shows that when you create an environment for people to feel seen, appreciated, like, you actually create something that people want, it's like the demand is there, like, they obviously have no shortage of people who want to work there, and if companies really took that into consideration with their strategy, like, okay, how can we make change that actually people actually makes them want to work here? I think that would solve a lot of the problems that they may be seeing. So I think this was a really interesting conversation, and I'm excited to see what the future holds in terms of the 40-hour work week.
Yeah. What's your final prediction on what do you think, let's say in the next I don't know, it's 2022 now, like in the next by 2030, let's say. So not even 100 years.
Mm,
So that's like um, you know,
my prediction, I
yeah.
think that there's going to be a lot more people who are going to learn how to uh, work on like a one-to-one type basis, like entrepreneurially. I think there's going to be a lot more people who will find themselves moving more in that direction,
Hmm.
because with how technology has been advancing, from what I'm seeing, companies are learning how to automate more. They're learning how to use technology in order to lower the costs of running the business in order to increase the output and just the overall efficiency. And I do find that those who will continue, well, this is like my personal perspective. I find that people who will continue to work in like the corporate setting in the future, um, I don't really see HR going anywhere. I see people who have experience with dealing with tech, machinery, fixing the machines that are actually doing the efficient work. Like I can see more of those roles definitely taking place. And I also think that as things are changing, people are going to get a lot more creative and a lot more, you know, when there's a need for something like the drive to get the answer, I think, is really going to be more prevalent within people. I know, like from my experience of traveling, and having to create um, income overseas, it's either make the money or get stuck in a foreign country. Like there was definitely incentive to make it work, and so I think when more people are found in a position to where they have no other choice than to make it work, I think there's going to be a lot of really amazing solutions that are going to come about.
Mm, that's good stuff. I think my prediction is kind of along those lines, but I think by 2030, I think this whole notion of full-time work will be maybe not gone completely, but I think it would be kind of like archaic. I think that the vast majority of people will kind of be known as specialists in like specific things. And I think there's going to be a lack of reliance on actual employees. And I think most people are going to be kind of like independent contractors. I think labor unions and stuff like that are probably going to erode, and it will make way for this groundswell of folks who kind of have these portfolio careers where, you know, I think of like Hustle Man from Martin, where he kind of had like he's like, I can, I sell CDs, like I cut
Yeah.
hair, like like you get to the cab, he's the cab driver. Like I think we're gonna see more of that type of thing. And it's not because, people don't want to necessarily work. I think, the human involvement, the tech piece that you mentioned, I think is certainly true. I think, the demand for technical talent specifically is going to probably drive most of those remaining, 40-hour full-time work things. But I see people just kind of selling out their services, their product, hanging out their shingle, and kind of doing it as a way to retain control over their life. And so when they are wanting to work more, so that their work can kind of match their lifestyle, like if they need a couple months off, they don't have to like quit their job. They can just be like, okay, well, I'm winding down this contract and like pick it up. And so, and I think even at the lower levels, quote, so to speak, of um, jobs, we're probably going to see that like right now, if you work as a stocker at Home Depot or like Lowe's, well, by then, robots are going to be doing like a lot of that stuff. But let's say you're doing like light customer service at some of these like positions, instead of you working just for Lowe's or just for Home Depot or just for, Walmart or Target or something like that. I think people are going to, you know, just kind of like Instacart now, you have like shoppers, people that are kind of doing that. I think that's an independent contractor relationship. Like I think that's what we're going to see more so than anything. So that's my prediction. I think the 40-hour work weeks time is days are numbered. I think it's on its way out. Certainly in the next, 20, 30 years, but certainly in the next like 100 years or so. It will be working much differently, and employees, if you even call them that, like independent contractors slash employees, will have significantly more power than companies, and work structures are going to have to adapt to that. So
Yes.
put it in the books. Danielle, thanks for another great episode. Y'all, thanks for listening. We'll have to decide if we keep this as one or two. I do see like podcasts and stuff with like super episodes, so maybe we can put it under that. But regardless, I think great conversation. Episode 2 is in the books, and we'll be looking forward to hearing y'all on the next episode of the Futures Fun podcast, and in the not too distant future. So yeah, talk to y'all soon. We still need a sound off phrase. So
How about this? The present was great, and we'll see you in the future.
we're workshopping. I like it.
Yeah.
I like the stance actually more than I like the stance more
We're
than the
working on
actual
it.
phrase. Yeah, we're going to workshop
In
it.
progress.
Talk to y'all
Bye.
later.